In my own ponds, I normally use shelves. When I dig the pond, I dig it in stages and create ledges or steps. That allows me to add rock and pebble throughout the pond. The larger rocks can form retaining walls on the vertical faces, and then the pebble sits on the flat shelf. It's really simple, it works, and it's the method that I use most often. But not everyone's building ponds the same way. Some people don't want rock and pebble inside the pond. Some of you are using pre-formed ponds, maybe stock tanks, old bathtubs, concrete ponds, or you just want a formal shape. Some of you want sand or beach entries. Some are renovating an existing pond that doesn't have shelves. And some of you want to create high vertical walls or ponds built beside existing structures. So today I want to show you a few different options for hiding the liner and pond edges, regardless of what type of pond you're building. But first, if you don't already know me, my name is Kev, and I help people build and maintain ponds without spending a fortune. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, consider subscribing and be sure to check out Ozponds.com. Now before we get into the different methods, I think every good pond edge comes down to three things: covering the liner, softening the edge, and preventing water loss. If you can do those three things, you're generally on the right track. Shelves, rocks and plants is my favourite method because it's simple and it works. Even if you don't want rock and pebble throughout the pond, you can often create a small shelf around the edge specifically to hide the liner. The shelf doesn't need to be large. Let's say you have a rock that's 30 centimetres or 1 foot tall. You might dig a small shelf that's around 15 centimetres or 6 inches deep, and that allows the rock to sit half in and half out of the water. You can then pull the liner up behind the rock and backfill with soil. And you can use the same principle for whatever material you want to use. You could use brick, concrete, timber, stumps, logs, or whatever material suits the style of pond that you're building. If I'm aiming for a natural look, I like to mix things up. Nature isn't uniform. I'll use different size rocks, some old stumps or logs, areas of pebble and lots of plants. And honestly, the plants end up doing most of the work. If I walk around my ponds today, much of the rock work is hidden by plants. The rocks create the structure, but the plants soften everything and make it look natural. I like to use low ground covers around the pond's edge and marginal plants inside the pond. The marginal plants help blur the edge between land and water, and they provide habitat for wildlife, and they remove nutrients from the water. Taller plants and shrubs can be used to frame focal points, while lower growing plants soften the edges without blocking the view. One thing you need to watch out for when doing your pond edge is wicking. Wicking happens when water's pulled above the waterline through roots, soil, dead leaves, fabric, moss, or even porous rocks. You can see it in this little pot pond. The moss above the water level stays wet because it's pulling water upward. Sometimes that water even escapes the container completely, and that's wicking. This is why I always try and keep the liner edge higher than I think I need. You want enough liner above the water level so that any wicking stays inside the pond rather than being pulled out into the surrounding landscape. People are often surprised by how much water rocks can absorb and move. The interesting thing is that you can sometimes use wicking to your advantage. I often see ponds where the water level sits well below the edging rocks, leaving exposed liner. I've often wondered whether some of those situations could be improved by deliberately using a piece of non-woven geotextile fabric or something else to wick water up onto the liner. If the fabric stays damp, you could potentially establish moss or moisture-loving ground covers such as baby tears and create a living green edge instead of looking at the exposed liner. I've never experimented with it much myself, I've just noticed it occurring naturally. But if I was going to try it, that's probably where I'd start. Just remember that the more wicking usually means more evaporation and more water loss during hot weather. Wicking also has the potential to pull moisture or water from the surrounding landscape, if it's saturated, into the pond. Sometimes this might bring in unwanted nutrients, and that's just something else to be aware of. Sometimes people don't want shelves, they want a gentle beach entry or a sloped edge, but the principle is still the same, and you can mix and match both approaches. Part of the slope should remain above the waterline, but most of it should continue below the water. Again, be generous with how much liner you leave above water level. The challenge with beach entries is preventing the material from sliding downhill. Sand requires a gentler slope than pebble. Whatever material you're using, you'll need some way of retaining the lower edge so it doesn't all end up in the deeper part of the pond. I like to use geotextile fabric to protect the liner, and if I was building a beach, I might also use a cellular confinement matrix or another retaining system to help keep everything in place. I haven't built any true beach entries myself, but I do occasionally soften pond edges with gentle slopes rather than using shelves everywhere. I think a mixture of shelves, slopes, rocks and plants often creates a more natural result than using the exact same treatment all the way around the pond. So what can you do if your pond doesn't have shelves? A lot of people contact me because they're renovating an existing pond, and maybe the pond was built years ago and maybe it has steep sides. But even if it never had shelves in the first place, the good news is you can still add them. I've seen people use sandbags to create the shelves. I've seen people backfill sections of the pond to build new planting ledges. If you're rebuilding the pond with a new liner, you can also reshape sections as you go. You could also build shelves inside the pond itself. You could create artificial shelves for plants. Even in my own ponds, I usually backfill behind my rock retaining walls. But the exact method isn't important. Understanding what the shelf is doing is what matters. You're simply creating stable areas for rock, plants, and edge treatments. Another question I get is about ponds built beside walls, patios, decks, and other structures. In this courtyard pond, there was already a small brick wall around the garden. I knew I wanted to sit there and watch the fish, so I didn't want the deeper water pushed further away by adding shelves. Instead, I dug straight down to around 60 centimetres or 2 feet deep in that area. I then laid down the liner in the geotextile and carefully built a small rock wall inside the pond. The wall was backfilled with smaller rock and built up layer by layer. On another pond, I used expanding foam to help lock some of the rocks together around a waterfall area. For small projects, that can work really well. If I was building something much larger, or a wall where failure could cause real damage, I'd be looking at proper retaining wall systems, engineered footings, and maybe some professional advice. Ponds with decks or patios extending out over the water can look fantastic, but once structures become involved, it's important to do things properly. In preform ponds or containers, the same principles apply. You still want to cover the edges and soften the transition between the pond and the surrounding landscape. Add some rocks, add some plants. I always like to bring some feature rocks out into the surrounding garden rather than creating a perfect ring around the pond. And personally, I prefer more foliage and less rock, but that's just my taste. Inside the container, you can add rock and pebble if you want. You can also heavily plant the pond. Many of my container ponds use a dirt and sand substrate with lots of aquatic plants. But if you want open water and you don't want rock and plants taking up space, painting the inside of the container black can help. But look, over time, biofilms, algae, and natural weathering will all usually soften the appearance anyway. Nature tends to do its own thing if you're patient. So not every pond needs rocks to hide the liner. One of my small formal ponds uses timber edging around the perimeter. The timber overhangs the water, so when you're standing beside the pond, it casts a shadow over the liner. The liner's still there, but it's black and your eye doesn't really notice it. And like I just mentioned, over time the biofilms and algae, some plant growth, it's going to naturally age those surfaces and it won't look artificial anyway. So sometimes the goal isn't to completely hide the liner. Sometimes it's enough to just stop drawing attention to it. Whenever I finish a pond, I like to leave the liner exposed for a while before completing the edge work. The most common leak's usually a low edge or a funny fold in the liner that lets water escape. So I want to see exactly where the water settles, and I want to see where any potential wicking points are. Basically, I want to be confident that the line is high enough before I permanently hide it. For me, the best looking ponds use a combination of rocks, plants, wood and natural materials rather than relying on just one thing. The rocks create structure and the plants soften everything. Together they help the pond blend into the landscape. But let me know in the comments how you like to finish your pond edges or any tricks you've discovered along the way. And if you'd like to build your pond using the same system I use in my own ponds, you can find my step-by-step guide on the Ozponds website. I hope this was helpful, and if you'd like to see how I plant my pond plants, check out this video next. Thanks for watching. See ya.